They accused me of espionage, of being an American spy.
His incredible journey of survival.
I've interviewed over 3,000 people. You have got the most fascinating travel stories.
Travel's the best education I've ever had.
You're one of the few Americans who've actually visited North Korea.
Never judge people by the actions of their government. People who have the least often give the most.
Why did the Syrian government suspect you of being a CIA spy?
This black pickup truck abruptly pulled up next to me. Two armed men jumped out of the back seat and instructed me to get inside.
Were you aware of the beheadings that were happening to American journalists?
For every one of the hostages or wrongful detainees around the world, there's also a family that's going through the hardest thing that they've ever been through. One of the most significant elements to this whole situation has been forgiveness. I found strength in that cell by doing three key things.
Sam Goodwin, welcome to the Ginni Show.
Thanks for having me.
Listen, Sam, I gotta say, I've interviewed over 2,000 to 3,000 people, but you have got the most, for want of a better word, fascinating travel stories. You're one of the few Americans who've actually visited North Korea. Let's start with, what was that like?
Sure. So at the time, I was living and working in Singapore, and it was March of 2016, and I was actually invited to North Korea to coach their national hockey team. And I grew up playing hockey my entire life, ended up playing a Division I in college. It was a big part of my upbringing, my life. And this was a unique opportunity to use the game to not only give back and coach, but also for a memorable cultural experience. And it's always great to use a sport to build a cultural bridge like that. I was treated incredibly well. When I was treated like royalty, truly, we everything was very well planned. And Ginni, I'm not oblivious to the fact that I saw what they wanted me to see. And getting off that kind of tourist track, so to speak, things can look different. But my experience was incredibly positive. The culture, the food, you've probably had Korean food, it's delicious. And everything that went into the trip, the opportunity to engage with locals, to learn about the country, to learn about the history, kind of in the way that they presented it to me, was memorable and one of the trips that probably get asked about quite a bit.
Were there any parts that you saw that you thought you weren't supposed to see?
There was one day where we took a bus from Pyongyang down to the DMZ, and we actually visited the DMZ from the north, which was a great experience. And actually, I had visited the DMZ from the south about 6 weeks earlier on a tour from Seoul. So ended up being probably 50 feet from where I had been 6 weeks earlier, but in a very different way. On the way down there from Pyongyang, we were on a bus, and the guides didn't know this, but the main highway was closed. And as a result, we had to take a detour for a few miles to kind of go around this closed highway. And that was the only time in our entire trip where our two guides, there was a male and female guide. Both of them were named Kim, for the record, but we had to take a detour, and we ended up driving through some remote villages. And this was the only time in our trip when our guides told us we could not take photos because we were getting off that track that they had sort of predetermined to be the track that we were going to stay on. And the small villages that we drove through was dirt roads. They were relatively underdeveloped, impoverished areas, and they asked us not to take photos there.
So you picked up on the energy change right away.
There was an energy change. There was an entire vibe change from the guides. Like, oh, we didn't prepare for this. Please, no photos here. And frankly, that got me kind of more interested. I was like, oh, what are we seeing that we're not supposed to see?
On the flip side, you've been to a lot of the countries. But what was it like in countries where people didn't really hide the struggles they were going through, when you can see a country for how raw it is compared to something like, this is what it is, but we don't want you taking this memory back with you?
One of the most significant things that I have learned through travel is that people who have the least often give the most. They tend to be overwhelmingly hospitable, overwhelmingly curious. They're very present in conversation. And these types of experiences have been some of the most memorable that I've had in all of my travel, kind of experiencing these people who have had a different life journey.
One thing that I particularly love about travel is you discover yourself on the journey in another place. What did you learn about yourself?
I totally agree with you. I think one of the best ways, understanding others is one of the best ways to better understand ourselves. I have a bachelor's, a master's, and a doctorate. Travel's the best education I've ever had. That perspective that really can only be developed through going and learning and physically being there.
What are some of the fundamental things that prevail throughout every country that you've been to, Sam?
First thing I would say is never judge people by the actions of their government. Oftentimes these people are in charge, but they're not an accurate reflection or representation of the people there. In my experience, the overwhelming majority of people in the world are well-intentioned, proud of their country, happy to help others. They are fundamentally good people. And everywhere I went in the world, I found people just like us. We're all fundamentally, basically the same.
It's amazing that you have this perspective and I guess outlook on people, given your experiences as well, because I want to go to what happened in Syria. Why did the Syrian government suspect you of being a CIA spy?
I don't know exactly what the answer is to that question. Of course, there's a decade-long conflict happening in Syria. That there's all kinds of instability. There are disputed regions. There are all kinds of complex issues happening, and any of those things. There was also my travel history and my where I had been and all these things. I would like to know for a few reasons. One, I just like to know because it happened, but actually more significantly, I would like to know because I don't want it to happen to anybody else.
Talk us through the point where, you were suspected as a CIA agent or a spy, and then you were held captive. What happened and what was going through your mind at the time?
I was walking through a roundabout on the way to meet up with my guide when all of a sudden this black pickup truck abruptly pulled up next to me. Two armed men jumped out of the back seat and instructed me to get inside. And thankfully they weren't violent, but I didn't have a choice. And I was scared, confused. I had no information or anyone to help. It was desperately trying to understand what was happening. And the men in the vehicle, as we sped away, they accused me of espionage, of being an American spy, of collaborating with terrorists, and nothing like this had ever happened to me before. And I went on to be held for 9 weeks, for 63 days. I was in solitary confinement for 27. And then I was moved for the rest of the time to a more general population type setting with lots of other inmates. And both of those presented different challenges and opportunities. Certainly, it was an upgrade to be moved out of solitary confinement, but there were both of those situations present their own types of challenges.
What did your cell look like when you were in solitary confinement?
The first was L-shaped, and it was, I would say, maybe 10 by 10 total, but it was shaped like an L. It was all concrete. There was no windows. I had nothing but a small blanket to lay on the concrete floor as a bed. And then the second cell I was moved to was smaller, and it was the same, but it was square. So, and it was smaller, but these were underground. I was many feet underground. There was no daylight other than when I would go to the bathroom. And that was essentially the setting that I was held in for a month.
Being in solitary confinement too, in any kind of confinement, how do you measure time?
Well, there were two main ways. One was I had to request to go to the bathroom, and I would bang on the door, and sometimes they would let me out. And the bathroom was just this hole in the floor about a few steps outside the cell door. But from that hole, I could look up and see this small window to the outside. And I could tell whether it was light out or dark. So I started to try to time my bathroom requests with when I thought there was a change from day to night so that I could confirm. And then the other way was I started to identify a trend in when the food was being brought, and it was just bread and boiled potatoes and water. But I started to identify when I thought I was getting this in roughly the morning and this in roughly the afternoon or evening. And I started and basically compared my bathroom visits with the food. And then I chipped this rock off the inside of the cell wall, and I carved a calendar in the wall. And I would mark days off as they passed, marking the passage of time and maintaining this connection to the outside, so to speak, was critical for maintaining emotional and psychological health in that type of situation when it was being deprived of essentially everything else.
Were you thinking about your loved ones in that time? Like, what was going through your mind?
Since being released, one of the most overwhelming things for me has been learning about all of the people who were involved in my case. Basically, I didn't know when I was trapped on the inside, I didn't know about anything that was happening on the outside. And it's 5 years later today, and I'm still saying thank you to people. I'm still learning about someone who made a phone call or said a prayer or talked to their friend, whatever it might have been. And when I was being held, Dan, to answer your question, I was wondering about all these things, and I was wondering about the well-being of my family, and would they try to find me? Would they be able to find me? What was going on? And it was kind of this just whirlwind of uncertainty, both with me and my family as well, and trying to entertain all of these different outcomes and different variables was emotionally and psychologically exhausting.
When your family learned you were in a prison in Syria, when did they learn that actually?
The news of my disappearance was essentially learned through me going dark. I was always very good about keeping in touch, especially if I was in more of an unstable place. And so they learned pretty quickly, just within those first few days. But they didn't know what had happened, but they knew that I had gone dark and that something wasn't right.
Were you aware of the beheadings that were happening to American journalists?
So I was generally aware. I of course, watched the news of Jim Foley in 2014 and knew about generally about the instability in Syria. And of course, I was thinking that if they're accusing me of these things, is my fate going to be similar? Are they going to treat me in the same way? And so that was constantly going through my mind. So I was kind of tangentially familiar with these instances. I know much more about them now in the wake of it because I've just learned more about it. But I knew just kind of as an average person would have known, given just how high profile the conflict generally was in Syria.
Did their mind go to where your mind went, where you could possibly have the same fate as the journalists that were beheaded?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And they started to learn about others who had been taken, others who had gone missing, whether it was just amidst the conflict, there could be a range of things that could have happened. So they were learning about all of those different variables. And this is a normal average family from the Midwest. They're not geopolitical experts. They're not government officials. So they're trying to get this crash course on the Middle East and and the history of the Arab Spring and all these things in a very short period of time, but they're putting all these pieces together and learning, and we're certainly hearing about the worst cases, the worst case scenario. And of course that all, I think what's important to remember is that for every one of the hostages or wrongful detainees around the world, there's also a family that's going through the hardest thing that they've ever been through also. And sometimes that doesn't kind of register or get as much attention as maybe it should. So they were also experiencing their own form of torture.
Were you given any daily updates about what was going to happen with your situation, or were you like, I just got to take and measure each day at a time?
In the first month, I was given nothing. I had no information at all. In the second month, I was able to interact with other people in the cell, but I was also being taken to court. I went to court 4 times, and in all 4 sessions, the judge denied me a lawyer, denied me a translator, continued to characterize me as a spy and a terrorist without providing any information about what might happen other than just, you have to wait another 2 weeks and then come back. Wait another 10 days, then come back. The whole trial was taking place inside this ideological vacuum and was not going to be impacted by anything I said or did. So I had a tiny bit of information there, basically not much, but then I was also becoming friends with the other inmates, and they were giving me information too to try to help. So it was very limited, but I did have something in that second month.
Did you feel a boost to your mental health? You said that when you moved into the prison with inmates, clearly you had a little bit of community there and people to communicate with and compare information to. Did you find yourself a little bit more optimistic when you were moved to that prison?
Solitary confinement is torture. It's a captivity tactic that's been used by cruel captors for centuries. Being moved to a place with other humans was certainly an upgrade, as I mentioned. No doubt, it had its own challenges. Like there was no privacy. It was sometimes loud. There were different challenges that I didn't have in the first month, but overall, there was absolutely a boost. I mean, being able to engage with people. A few of them spoke English, so I was able to communicate with them. Virtually none of them were true criminals. They were just victims of a corrupt system and had been caught up in the instability of the conflict. I'll never forget, about 2 weeks into the second month, I went to one of the men who had become a decent friend, and I said, hey, everybody here is being so nice to me. It was just kind of hard to know what to expect in a situation like this. And I'll never forget his response. He said, Sam, in Syria, all the good people are here in prison because all the bad people are outside putting us in here.
That's scary to hear when you're inside, right? That can feel isolating in and of itself.
For sure. On one hand, I was like, oh, I'm great. It's great to be surrounded by good people, but also the people who were holding the keys literally and figuratively to the rest of my life were presumably bad.
You said solitary confinement is torture. What mentality did you have to get through those 27 days?
I found strength in that cell by doing 3 key things. After several days of pacing back and forth, I finally stopped. I said, hang on a second. Maybe, it's a bit counterintuitive, but maybe there's some good in this situation. Maybe there's some positivity here, something to be grateful for. And to that, I remember an inner voice replying and saying, Sam, are you crazy? You've just been taken hostage. There's nothing good here. There's nothing to be grateful for. The best this will ever be is a period of your life you can forget. But I fought that inner voice, and I remember thinking, I'm grateful to be alive. I'm grateful for my health, my education. I'm grateful for the basic food and water I'm being given. I actually said to myself, I'm grateful for the air that I'm breathing, and that the guard who just delivered me a boiled potato smiled at me for 1 second. I mean, these things may sound elementary or insignificant, but I found that each one of these small expressions of gratitude became this silent rebellion against the uncertainty of the situation. So the first, again, perhaps a bit paradoxically, was to lean into gratitude. The second point, after channeling a little bit of strength from the gratitude exercise, I didn't want to then just sit around and do nothing. Despite being in this 8x8 cell, I wanted to take action. And this is also a bit weird because solitary confinement, as you mentioned, by definition means no action. There's no movement. It's confinement, isolation. But I wanted to take action and try to control the things that I could control. And many things, maybe the majority of things, were out of my control. I mean, I couldn't control when or even if I'd be released. I couldn't control whether they finally figured out I wasn't a spy. But I could control my thoughts, my attitude, my prayers. I could control my exercise. I had this exercise routine with push-ups and sit-ups and core exercises. I could control how much water I drank and when I went to sleep at night. I could control my routine within that cell. And what I realized was that my goal wasn't to get rid of negative thoughts and feelings. That's, I think, unrealistic. My goal was to change the way I responded to them. Mm-hmm. So the second thing was to try to take action and control the things I could control. And then the third, again, after several days of pacing back and forth, this strange transformative perspective began to emerge. I mean, being taken hostage was as insane of a situation as I could have ever imagined being in, but I began to realize and believe that perhaps if I could maintain hope, persevere through this, I would then be better equipped to take on more challenges in my life going forward. And recognizing this opportunity for growth as I came to see it was what helped fuel me to get from 1 second to the next, to survive from 1 minute to the next, 1 day or week to the next. And what I found was that there's a big difference between what uncertainty feels like and what's actually happening. So the three things that were really helpful to me was one, to lean into gratitude. Second was to really focus on the things that I could control. And the third was to try to recognize uncertainty as an opportunity.
What is your gratitude practice like now?
I talk a lot about gratitude today. I mean, the problem, the challenge that I think a lot of people have with gratitude is they lack perspective. And I'm trying to use my story and my experiences to get people to practice reframing their perspective, especially when facing challenges and uncertainty. Being content and grateful for what we have and not envious for what we don't have, while still being ambitious, is, I think, a different way to think about being satisfied.
After going through that experience, what's one thing that you have promised yourself to live life by?
One of the biggest takeaways that I have from this experience is just the way that I approach challenges and obstacles in my life. I find myself clearing my head, having a much more level-headed approach to challenges. I think that rock bottom taught me things that a mountaintop never could. And I actually feel fortunate for having been pushed to literally rock bottom, because now I have that perspective that I think I can live by, especially when it comes to facing challenges and uncertainty. And that's really been kind of the foundation of my work now, is really living by some of the things that I learned when I was at my lowest point.
You didn't know why you were there, and you still to this day don't know why that you were there. It's kind of like moving on or accepting an apology that you never got. But you've had to apply certain mindsets to be like, I need to let that go to move on.
One of the most significant elements to this whole situation has been forgiveness. And I view the world through a spiritual lens. I believe this was given to me for a reason. I was and am working to forgive people who weren't even sorry. And that's strength. I've learned that forgiveness is not a feeling, it's a choice. This was an incredibly uncomfortable situation for myself and my family. At the same time, there's been so much good that's come from it. And I've really tried to focus on those positives while also keeping myself healthy and and surrounding myself with the right people and kind of finding that balance.
Sam, you've written this into a book. How many pages was your book? Because I am curious to see how you could possibly fit this into a handheld book.
Thanks. It's 288 pages, and it took a few years to really consolidate everything for a range of reasons. One being that I learned pretty quickly when I was released that half the story wasn't even mine to tell. It was what happened to my family on the outside and everything that they were dealing with. And in some ways, I feel like I had the easy part when I learned about everything that happens on the outside in a situation like this. There are really two stories that are pushed forward together, me on the inside, my family on the outside, in kind of this Apollo 13-esque fashion. It toggles between this under-resourced entity stuck on the inside and a group of people trying to help that entity.
Has writing this book been healing for you in some way?
It has been. It's been therapeutic just to have a definitive record of what happened, to have the participation of all the people who were involved, and to also, on one hand, it's what I think is an unforgettable story that includes a travel journey to every country in the world, heads of state, high stakes diplomacy, celebrities, but also, and perhaps more importantly, it's also about what we all learned through this experience that we think can help others today. It's about how we can all turn our own challenges and adversities into assets. I mean, I don't want to be known for the things that happened to me. I really want to be known for the way I've responded to them. And I hope the readers of this book, in addition to being perhaps entertained by the drama, will also adapt a similar mindset and implement it into their own personal, professional, or even spiritual lives.
Well, Sam, thanks so much for joining us on the Ginni Show. I have definitely taken away a deeper sense of gratitude.
Ginni, I just really appreciate this opportunity to be on the show and to be part of your community of listeners, and just really grateful to you for the invitation.